What if destiny was not a crown placed upon the head, but a whisper that waits to be answered? What if one woman's choice, made at a well beneath a desert sky, carried the weight of 1,000 generations? Have you ever wondered why heaven watched her so closely? Why did angels stand still as she offered water to a stranger, not knowing she was watering the roots of Israel itself? There are names in Scripture that blaze like stars: Abraham, Jacob, Moses, yet hidden among them is a name that shimmers in silence: Rebekah, a woman whose story begins with gentleness but ends with the turning of history itself. Stay with me, for by the end of this night, you will see how a single act of kindness became the river through which God's promise flowed, and how destiny, once chosen, never sleeps. If your soul remembers the light, if you've ever felt that quiet pull toward something ancient and divine, stay with us. Subscribe and walk this sacred path once more, for the stories of the women who remembered heaven are the stories that remember us. Before her name was ever spoken by angels, before her hands drew water from the ancient well, there was only silence, the kind that breathes between the dunes. The land of Nahor lay quiet beneath the sun, a kingdom of dust and distance. The people there lived by rhythm, rising with the dawn, sleeping beneath the whisper of stars. But among them was a young woman whose heart never fully belonged to the earth. Her name was Rebekah, and though she smiled, her soul was listening for something more. Every morning she carried her jar upon her shoulder, walking through the breath of dawn to the well that shimmered like a mirror to heaven. The air smelled of clay and wheat. Her footsteps pressed into the sand, leaving no trace, for even the desert guarded her path. There was grace in her movement, the quiet strength of someone who had learned to serve without bitterness. But inside her chest was a gentle ache, a question that had no words. She often looked to the horizon and wondered what waited beyond the ridges of light. The elders spoke of destiny as if it were a story written only for men, for kings, for prophets, for warriors. Yet Rebekah sensed something else. Destiny, she felt, was not about power. It was about listening. About hearing the softest call and answering with one's life. And so she waited, not idly, but faithfully, her heart becoming a vessel for something unseen. At night, the stars would bloom over the plains like seeds of eternity. Rebekah would lie awake, hearing her own breath mingle with the wind. Sometimes she imagined a great thread connecting her to the unseen, a golden line drawn from her soul to the heavens. She did not yet know that this thread would soon tighten and pull her toward the promise made to Abraham, the covenant of nations. She only knew that she felt watched not by men but by something holy. The people of Nahor spoke often of Abraham's God, the one who called men out of their lands into deserts of faith. Rebekah wondered what it meant to be called. Was it a sound, a dream, a sign in the water's reflection? She did not know, but she believed that if the divine ever whispered to her, she would hear it. And she would answer. One morning, as she approached the well, the air felt different, heavier, as though the sky itself had lowered to listen. Her jar struck the water with a deeper echo. She paused, her eyes tracing the ripples that spread across the surface. For a moment she thought she saw her reflection shimmer into two faces, one her own, the other shadowed, ancient and kind. Then it was gone. The women around her laughed and chattered, unaware of the quiet tremor that passed through her spirit. But Rebekah knew. Something had shifted. The air carried promise. The desert was no longer silent, it was waiting. That night she could not sleep. The moonlight poured like silver across her window, and the wind outside whispered names she could not yet understand. She rose and pressed her hand against the cool stone wall, feeling the faint pulse of the earth. Somewhere beyond those sands, a story was moving toward her, guided by prayer, carried by a servant, written by heaven itself. And though she did not yet know it, before another dawn passed, that story would find her. At her well, with her water jar, in the place where waiting becomes destiny. Morning broke upon the land of Nahor like a slow exhale. The light touched the stones before it reached the faces of men, as if heaven itself hesitated before revealing its fire. Rebekah rose before the others, always before the others, moving through the still air with the quiet certainty of one who knew the rhythm of dawn. The sand was cool beneath her feet. The sky above her was pale and merciful. In the village, voices still slept. Goats murmured softly in their pens, the smell of grain lingered in the air, and smoke curled from the last of the night's embers. The well waited for her like an old friend. It had seen her every day since she was a child, had watched her grow from a curious girl who played with the shadows in the water to a woman whose eyes carried the reflection of heaven's patience. She set down her jar and knelt beside the well's rim. The stones were worn smooth by generations of hands. She traced her fingers along them as though they could tell her something, perhaps the stories of the women who came before her. She thought of Sarah, Abraham's wife, who once laughed at the impossible and yet bore a son of promise. Would her own story ever be written into the same light? When Rebekah lowered the jar, her reflection trembled and disappeared. She watched the circles spread, widening, fading, returning to stillness. That stillness felt sacred, as though the well itself understood secrets that even the prophets could not speak aloud. As she drew the water, her arms glistened in the morning sun. She felt strength in her hands, the kind that comes not from pride but from service. Each movement was a prayer of its own, to draw water, to serve others, to live in quiet obedience to what one does not yet understand. An old woman passed by and greeted her with a smile. "Still rising with the stars, child," she said. Rebekah returned the smile. "The water tastes sweeter when the sky is still dreaming." The woman laughed, shaking her head, and continued on. But Rebekah's gaze lingered on the horizon. Something within her stirred, a quiet certainty that her days of waiting were numbered. She could not name it, but her soul had begun to hum with the same rhythm that moved the constellations. That afternoon she returned home carrying the filled jar. Her brother Laban called to her from the doorway, his voice impatient but familiar. "You spend more time with the well than with your family," he said. Rebekah smiled faintly. "The well listens better." Laban rolled his eyes but said no more. She entered her room, setting the jar beside the window where sunlight turned the water to gold. She sat there for a long time, watching the light bend and ripple. She did not know that this same water would soon quench the thirst of Abraham's servant, that this moment of calm would be remembered in heaven as the stillness before the turning of ages. Outside, a wind began to rise, soft at first, then deeper, carrying the scent of journey and dust. Far beyond the hills, a caravan moved through the wilderness. Among its travelers was a man who prayed with every step, searching for a sign, for a woman whose spirit would be gentle enough to water his camels and strong enough to carry the promise of nations. That night, Rebekah dreamed. She was standing by the well again, but the water glowed like molten glass. The stars above her bent low, their reflections burning across the surface. From the depths came a voice, not of words, but of presence. It spoke to her in silence, and her heart answered, though she did not know how. When she awoke, tears glistened on her face. She felt no fear, only peace. Outside, dawn returned. The same light, the same path, the same well. But destiny was now within sight, walking toward her through the desert haze. The sun climbed higher that day, burning gold upon the stones, until the air shimmered like a veil of glass. Rebekah walked her familiar path toward the well once more, her jar balanced against her shoulder, her eyes softened by thought. But though her steps were the same, the silence was not. The world felt charged, as though heaven had drawn its breath and held it. When she reached the edge of the village, she paused. Dust moved on the horizon, a thin line of movement against the still air. At first she thought it was a mirage, a trick of heat and distance. But then she saw the faint shimmer of metal, the silhouettes of camels swaying in rhythm, the figures of men bent from the road. Travelers. Her heart stirred. Something in her spirit recognized this moment, though she had never seen these strangers before. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of faraway lands, myrrh, sand, cedar, and prayer. She stepped forward, the jar still in her hands, and waited. The lead traveler slowed his camel and dismounted. His robes were heavy with dust. His eyes carried the weary glow of one who had not slept. He leaned against his staff and whispered not to her but to the sky. Rebekah could not hear all the words, but she sensed what they were: a plea, a test, a prayer offered to the God of Abraham. He turned toward her. "Please," he said softly, "let me drink a little water from your jar." Her heart answered before her lips could move. "Drink, my lord," she said, lowering the jar with steady hands. The water caught the sunlight as he drank, and for a moment the entire world seemed to still, the air, the wind, even her pulse. When he lifted his eyes again, there was something holy in them. He did not thank her in haste. He simply looked at her as though he were seeing prophecy made flesh. Rebekah smiled gently, then turned to the camels. "I will draw water for them also, until they have finished drinking." The servant's breath caught. His prayer had been answered not by thunder but by kindness. He watched as Rebekah moved to the well again and again, her arms strong, her motions unbroken. The camels bowed their necks, the water glistened, and time itself seemed to bend around her, one act of generosity echoing across eternity. When at last the work was done, the servant approached her with trembling hands. From a pouch of worn leather he drew out a ring of gold and 2 bracelets that caught the dying sun. He placed them upon her as one would place light upon the chosen. "Tell me," he asked softly, "whose daughter are you?" Rebekah answered with humility, her voice calm and sure. "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him." She gestured toward her home. "We have both straw and enough feed and room to lodge." The servant's knees touched the earth. He bowed low and whispered words that made the air tremble. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and truth." Rebekah stood still, her pulse quiet but alive with wonder. She did not yet understand what had happened, but she felt it. Something vast, something divine, had just crossed her path. Her small kindness had opened a door in heaven. As the servant rose and followed her toward her family's home, Rebekah's thoughts drifted like the dust behind them. She remembered the shimmering reflection she had seen in the well, the 2 faces merging into one. Now she knows. It had not been a dream, it was a foretelling. That night, as the stars burned high above Nahor's land, the prayers of Abraham's servant rose into the same sky, and the echo of those prayers found their rest in her heart. The desert had been waiting for her all along. The night before destiny arrived, the stars were restless. They burned low and bright above the sands, whispering across the heavens like a secret about to be told. Rebekah dreamed again of water and wind, of footsteps echoing through the well's hollow throat. But this time the dream did not fade when she awoke. It followed her, breathing in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The morning air was soft, carrying the faint scent of acacia and ash. Rebekah's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her jar, though she did not know why. The same path, the same earth, yet every shadow felt watchful, alive. She could not see it, but far beyond the ridge, a servant of Abraham had been praying for her through the long desert night. His name was Eliezer, though Rebekah did not yet know it. He had traveled across miles of emptiness carrying one prayer upon his tongue. "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, grant me success this day and show steadfast love to my master." His camels had knelt in the sand outside the city, their hums like low hymns to the rising sun. And when he looked upon the well, he whispered the words that would draw heaven's gaze. "Let the woman who offers me water and also waters my camels be the one you have chosen." He had not yet finished the prayer when Rebekah appeared. The moment was small, a girl walking toward a well, yet the fabric of creation shifted around it. Eliezer watched her in silence, awe building like dawn behind his eyes. She moved with calm grace, the hem of her robe brushing against the dust, her jar shining in the morning light. It was as if the desert itself carried her forward. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of gentle certainty. "Drink, my lord." Eliezer held the jar as though it were a holy vessel. The water was cool, drawn from deep within the earth, but it tasted of something more, of promise, of fulfillment, of peace. And as he drank, his heart knew what his mind dared not yet believe, that God had already answered. Rebekah turned without hesitation to the camels, her hands steady and her steps sure. There was no calculation in her kindness, no pause of doubt. She drew water until each beast bowed its head in contentment. Every drop that spilled was a testament, every motion a prayer in motion. Eliezer could not move. He stood frozen between disbelief and reverence. The test he had whispered into the wind had come alive before his eyes. He felt the weight of divine choreography, that heaven had been walking beside him all along, leading him to this single act of compassion. When at last the camels were satisfied, he stepped forward, tears rising in the dust. He reached into his satchel and drew forth gold, a nose ring, 2 bracelets, tokens not of wealth but of covenant. He placed them upon her hands with trembling gratitude, his voice low as a psalm. "Whose daughter are you?" Rebekah answered, her eyes soft yet unwavering. "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, wife of Nahor." For Eliezer, the name struck like lightning. Nahor, Abraham's brother. The circle of promise was closing. He bowed his head until his forehead touched the sand. "Blessed be the Lord who led me straight to my master's kin." Rebekah's heart beat like the wings of a dove. She sensed holiness in this stranger's voice, not of fear but of remembrance. She offered him lodging, unaware that her invitation would open the door to destiny itself. Together they walked through the fields toward her father's home, and behind them the camels groaned softly, their shadows stretching long and gold in the afternoon sun. That night, under a sky that hummed with unseen joy, Eliezer bowed in thanksgiving and Rebekah lay awake, not in restlessness, but in quiet awe. For the first time she understood that her waiting had not been empty. It had been the preparation of her spirit for the moment heaven arrived disguised as a thirsty traveler. The well that once reflected only her face now reflected eternity. Rebekah's home glowed with the soft light of evening lamps as she entered, guiding the stranger through the doorway. The scent of baked grain and oil filled the room, mingling with the dust of travel still clinging to his garments. Laban, her brother, noticed the golden bracelets on her arms and the nose ring glinting in the lamplight, gifts not given lightly. His eyes widened, for he saw not jewelry but destiny's mark. "Come in, blessed of the Lord," he said, bowing with respect he could not yet explain. "Why do you stand outside when there is room prepared for you?" Eliezer, still trembling from the weight of answered prayer, entered humbly. His voice was quiet but filled with reverence, like a man still walking in the echo of a miracle. Servants washed his feet and straw was laid for the camels, but before he ate, he raised his hand. "I will not eat until I have told my errand." They gathered around the table Bethuel, Rebekah's father, Laban her brother, and the women who lingered by the walls to listen. Rebekah stood near the doorway, her shadow stretched by the lamp's soft flame, and Eliezer began to speak. His words were not his own. They were guided by memory, by promise, by the faith of his master. He told them of Abraham, the man who left his homeland to follow the unseen God, of Isaac, the son of laughter and sacrifice, of the oath sworn by hand upon his master's thigh, binding him to find a wife not from the Canaanites but from Abraham's own kin. As he spoke, Rebekah's breath deepened. Every word felt familiar, as if she had heard it before, not in this life, but in a dream whispered before birth. "I prayed," said Eliezer, "that the maiden who offered me water and also my camels would be the one chosen by the Lord, and before I had finished speaking in my heart she came." His voice trembled. "Your daughter, Rebekah." A hush fell, the lamps flickered, even the camels outside seemed quiet. Bethuel lowered his gaze, Laban's hands rested upon the table. "The thing comes from the Lord," Bethuel said at last. "We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, that she may be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." The words fell like stones into the river of history, and the ripples still move through time. Eliezer bowed his face to the earth in worship. "Blessed be the Lord, who has led me in the way of truth to the house of my master's brethren." He brought forth gifts of gold and silver, garments woven with the thread of promise, and laid them before Rebekah's family. That night laughter filled the tent. The sound of joy mingled with the faint hum of prophecy, though few could hear it. Rebekah sat by the doorway, her eyes upon the stars. She thought of the man she had never seen, Isaac, son of Abraham, heir of a covenant spoken by God himself. She wondered what kind of man waited for her in Canaan, what kind of love was written into such divine purpose. The wind outside brushed her face with cool fingers, carrying the scent of the distant land she would soon call home. Her heart did not fear the unknown, it longed for it. She understood something the others did not, that obedience was not a burden but a bridge, a way for heaven to touch the earth through human choice. Before she slept, she touched the bracelets on her wrists and whispered a prayer of her own, not for wealth, nor for safety, but for courage. "O Lord," she murmured, "let me walk the path you have written for me, even if I do not see where it leads." Outside, the stars shimmered like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Tomorrow she will be asked to choose, and the world would never be the same. Dawn crept quietly into the house of Bethuel, pale light gathering on the woven curtains. The air was still, filled with the hush that comes before the decision. Rebekah woke early, her heart already aware of what the day would bring. In the courtyard, the camels knelt in silence, their shadows stretching long across the earth. Eliezer stood beside them, his eyes lifted in prayer. Inside, Rebekah's mother and brother were speaking softly. They wished her to stay a little longer, 10 days, perhaps more, to prepare, to say farewell, to delay what could not be undone. But Rebekah felt the same pull that had guided her every step to the well. It was not impatience. It was for a purpose. The same voice that had stirred the desert now stirred her soul. When Eliezer entered, his head bowed low, his words were gentle but urgent. "Do not delay me," he said. "The Lord has prospered my journey. Send me away so that I may go to my master." Bethuel and Laban exchanged glances, then turned to Rebekah. "Let us call the girl and ask her." The room grew still. The air seemed to listen. Rebekah entered quietly, her eyes calm, her spirit unshaken. She stood before them, her mother's daughter, yet already belonging to something greater. Laban's voice was steady, but beneath it trembled both love and disbelief. "Will you go with this man?" There was no pause, no hesitation, only the soft strength of faith made flesh. "I will go." The words were simple, but they opened the gates of destiny. Even the wind seemed to sigh in reverence. Somewhere far away, the promise given to Abraham breathed anew. Heaven moved its hand upon the world, and the covenant began to unfold through a woman's courage. Her mother wept softly, blessing her with trembling fingers. "Our sister, may you become thousands of thousands, and may your offspring possess the gates of their enemies." The blessing fell over her like light. And so, with only the clothes upon her back and the quiet fire in her heart, Rebekah mounted the camel and turned her face toward the horizon. She did not look back. The desert opened before her, vast, golden, endless. Every step forward was a step away from the life she had known, and a step closer to the life heaven had written. Eliezer rode beside her in silence, awed by her composure. He had seen faith before, but never like this. The days that followed were long. The heat shimmered like a living flame, and the nights were cold enough to make the stars tremble. But Rebekah did not falter. Her eyes stayed fixed upon the line where earth met sky, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would smile faintly, as though she were already hearing the echo of her future. Eliezer would watch her from afar, marveling. He saw in her the same faith that once burned in Abraham, the same unshakable trust that walks into the unknown without proof, without map, without fear. He understood then that God's promises were never built upon stone, but upon hearts willing to say yes. At night, when the caravan rested, Rebekah would sit by the fire, her veil drawn close. The wind would brush against her face and she would close her eyes, listening to it whisper like an ancient friend. Sometimes she imagined Isaac praying beneath another sky, unaware that his answer was already on its way, carried by faith, guarded by stars. And as the fire dimmed, she whispered into the flames, "Let me be worthy of this path." The journey continued, a quiet procession across the wilderness. The sand stretched out before her like time itself, and above her, heaven smiled. Soon, the road would lead her to a field at eventide, where one man waited, praying in silence as promise met promise. But that is a story for another chapter. The road wound through dunes and memory, carrying Rebekah closer to a name she had never spoken, Isaac. The journey had reshaped her. The sand that once burned beneath her feet now felt familiar, a rhythm beneath her destiny. Days passed without count. The stars marked her progress better than any map, and each sunrise felt like a promise kept between her and the divine. When the caravan reached the borders of Canaan, the air changed. It was softer here, touched with the scent of olives and dusted fig leaves. The mountains rose like sleeping prophets, and the wind carried stories of a people chosen long ago. Rebekah felt the pull of history around her. Every breath was a prayer, every silence a vow. Eliezer rode ahead, his heart full of gratitude. The God of his master had guided him faithfully, and now the promise was almost fulfilled. Yet even as joy filled him, awe held him still. He knew he was escorting not merely a woman, but the vessel of generations, the one through whom the covenant would continue to breathe. That night, as they rested beneath a grove of tamarisk trees, Eliezer approached her. "You have not once questioned the road," he said softly. "Many would have turned back." Rebekah smiled faintly. "When the call is clear, the road is only obedience." Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had already seen the end from the beginning. The servant bowed his head, humbled by her grace. The following morning, the caravan descended into the valley where Abraham's tent stood, wide, pale shelters glimmering like moons across the PL. Rebekah's pulse quickened. She had heard tales of Abraham's faith, of the mountain where he bound his son, of the ram that had saved the promise. To walk upon the same earth felt sacred. They entered the camp as the sun dipped low. Servants gathered, eyes filled with curiosity. Word spread quickly. Abraham's messenger had returned, and not alone. Inside the great tent, Eliezer knelt before his master and recounted everything, from his prayer beside the well to the moment Rebekah said, "I will go." Abraham wept softly, his aged hands trembling with gratitude. The covenant was alive, moving, breathing, unfolding exactly as heaven had sworn. Outside, Rebekah waited, the evening light resting upon her veil. She could hear faint murmurs, the sound of worship, the echo of blessing. Though she had traveled far, she felt no weariness, only peace. Later, Abraham's household prepared a feast, the air filled with the aroma of roasted grain and sweet dates. Yet amidst the laughter and music, Rebekah sat quietly, gazing beyond the firelight. She wondered about Isaac, what kind of man he was, what his eyes might hold, what prayers he had spoken beneath these very stars. When Eliezer approached her again, his face glowed like one who had seen heaven's design unfold before him. "Tomorrow," he said gently, "you will meet him." Rebekah's hands tightened around the edge of her veil. For the first time, her heart fluttered with something not quite fear, not quite longing, but a trembling awareness that her life was about to become more than her own. She looked toward the horizon, where the last line of gold faded into violet. The stars began to bloom again, one by one, ancient and patient. Beneath them, she whispered to herself, "If this is the path the Almighty has chosen for me, let my heart not falter." The wind answered with a sigh through the tamarisk leaves. And somewhere in another field not far away, a man was praying as the dusk gathered, his voice rising with the same longing that had guided her all along. The distance between them was only the width of dawn. That night, Rebekah did not sleep. The camp had quieted. Even the camels, weary from the road, made no sound. The stars shone with a strange intensity, as if they were watching her, waiting for her answer to the life that now unfolded before her. She stepped outside her tent, the sand cool beneath her feet, the air filled with the scent of the fire's last embers. Above her, the constellations traced the same ancient patterns that Abraham once followed when God said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them." Rebekah closed her eyes and whispered to the night, "I am one of those stars, aren't I?" The question hung in the dark, neither answered nor denied, but the silence that followed was warm, alive, full of unseen presence. At dawn, she prepared herself for the meeting. The servants dressed her in soft linen, white as the wings of light. The veil was drawn across her face, not to conceal beauty, but to honor mystery. Her hands trembled only once when she touched the fabric, for in that moment she felt the weight of all the women before her, Sarah, Milcah, and those whose names were forgotten, each one who had carried the promise forward through faith. When the caravan began to move again, the air shimmered with quiet expectancy. The road wound through gentle hills now, not barren like the northern deserts, but clothed with olive trees and whispering grasses. Rebekah's heart beat slowly, as if in rhythm with the camel's steady gait. She was no longer leaving her past, she was walking toward prophecy. As the day waned, the sky blushed with the colors of ending, amber, violet, and rose. The servant rode ahead, his heart lifted in prayer, that the meeting might be peaceful, that the promise might be fulfilled without sorrow. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of earth freshly watered, and far in the distance the silhouette of a man appeared. He was standing alone in the field at eventide. His head was bowed, his hands clasped. The horizon behind him blazed with dying light, and for a moment Rebekah thought he was part of the landscape, as if the very earth had taken human form to meet her. "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" she asked. Eliezer turned to her, "Reverent." "It is my master, Isaac." The words seemed to stop time. The veil slipped through her fingers and she covered her face as custom required, but also because her heart trembled with awe. Not fear, no doubt. Awe, for this was no stranger. This was the fulfillment of every silent prayer, every patient moment, every act of faith that had guided her from the well to this field. Isaac lifted his eyes and saw the caravan approaching, and among the travelers, one figure veiled in gold and dust, radiant even in the dimming light. The scripture would later say simply, "And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife, and he loved her." But in that moment before words there was recognition, two souls meeting not for the first time, but for the first time again. As the camels slowed and Rebekah dismounted, the air between them shimmered with peace. No words were needed. The promise had been kept. The covenant, once bound to a man's faith, now rested upon a woman's choice. That night, as stars blossomed across the heavens, the household of Abraham rejoiced. The promise of nations had found its next bearer, not through conquest, not through thunder, but through the quiet faith of a woman who said yes when heaven called. The desert that had once waited for her was now behind her, silent and fulfilled. The first evening in Isaac's tent was quiet. The servants had withdrawn, leaving only the scent of frankincense and the rustle of the desert wind. Rebekah sat near the low flame of an oil lamp, her veil folded beside her, her eyes reflecting the soft flicker of light. Isaac entered with measured steps, his face gentle, marked not by the pride of a son of promise, but by the stillness of one who had known grief. For even before he saw her, he had been carrying the memory of his mother, Sarah, whose absence still lingered like perfume on the fabric of the tent. When Rebekah lifted her gaze, he paused. Something in her presence, the quiet reverence, the unwavering calm, filled the empty spaces in his heart. It was as if the tent itself breathed again, as if light had found its way back into a place once draped in shadow. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was sacred. It was the meeting of two prayers, one uttered beneath desert skies by a man waiting for comfort, and another whispered beside a well by a woman who longed to be chosen by heaven. When Isaac finally spoke, his voice was soft, like the wind that moves the sand without sound. "You left your home for this path," he said. "Were you not afraid?" Rebekah smiled faintly. "Only once, before I knew that faith and fear could not live in the same heart." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded as though he understood. He did. For faith had been his inheritance too, born of the father who believed in the unseen and the mother who laughed at the impossible. As the night deepened, the lamp's light dimmed to a glow, and the stars pressed close to the fabric above. Somewhere outside, the camels murmured in their sleep, and the cool wind carried the scent of myrrh. Inside, Rebekah and Isaac sat together, the weight of divine purpose resting gently between them. It was not romance as the world knows it. It was remembrance, two souls recognizing the thread that had bound them long before they met. Over the days that followed, Rebekah learned the rhythms of her new life. She rose with the dawn, as she always had, walking the borders of the camp in silence. Sometimes she saw Isaac in the fields, his head bowed in meditation. He prayed not for power or legacy, but for peace, for the quiet harmony that comes when one walks with heaven's will. Their union was not loud or adorned with spectacle. It was steady, like the movement of stars, invisible in its beginning, eternal in its reach. The servants spoke softly of them, saying that where Isaac walked, the ground seemed gentler. Where Rebekah smiled, the tents felt lighter. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in gold and violet, Rebekah stood outside their tent, the breeze tugging gently at her hair. Isaac joined her, silent as always. They watched the horizon together, where light surrendered to night. "Do you ever wonder," Rebekah whispered, "why God writes his promises in the language of waiting?" Isaac's eyes softened. "Because waiting teaches the heart what strength cannot." She turned toward him, her expression calm, illuminated by the last light of day. In his eyes she saw her journey reflected: the well, the stranger, the choice, the desert, and beneath it all, the steady hand of the divine. When darkness fell, Rebekah breathed a prayer into the night air. Not for children, not for wealth, but for wisdom, to remain faithful when silence returned, to listen when heaven grew quiet again. The wind carried her prayer into the distance, over fields, over tents, into the heart of the promise itself. And heaven, listening, prepared the next chapter, one of silence, of barrenness, and of the strange, sacred miracles that grow in waiting hearts. The first dawn in Canaan rose like a gentle fire. Its light poured over the land with sacred patience, brushing the edges of stone and olive branches, touching the tents of Abraham's household until everything shimmered in quiet praise. Rebekah awoke to that light, to the soft hum of life around her, to the slow rhythm of a new world breathing. The tent beside her stirred with movement, the sound of women preparing grain, the murmur of servants drawing water. Yet even amidst the noise, she felt a deep stillness inside as if her soul were being reshaped, molded by the same hands that had carved the mountains. The air was clean, filled with promise. She was no longer the maiden of Nahor's land. She was the bride of the covenant, the woman through whom heaven's story would continue to unfold. Isaac met her outside the tent. The light caught his face, revealing the gentleness that had drawn heaven's favor upon him. He did not speak right away, neither did she. The silence between them had become its own language. She saw in him not only a husband, but a reflection of her own faith, steadfast, unwavering, anchored to something eternal. Together they walked the fields that morning. The soil beneath their feet was sacred, the same earth promised to Abraham beneath the stars. Dew sparkled like tiny constellations scattered across the grass. Isaac showed her the wells his father had dug, each one a mark of faith and survival. "Here," he said, resting his hand on the cool stone rim, "my father called upon the name of the Lord." Rebekah touched the stone, feeling its history hum beneath her fingertips. "Then this is not just earth," she said softly. "It is a memory." Isaac smiled. "Yes, every grain of dust here remembers his voice." They walked until the sun climbed high. Shadows bent and lengthened around them. The wilderness beyond the field stretched wide, vast and endless, shimmering with heat. Rebekah gazed toward it, sensing both beauty and danger. "The desert teaches silence," she said almost to herself. "But silence also teaches trust." Isaac nodded, his gaze following hers. "Out there," he said, "my father was tested. Out there the promise began. The wilderness is where God listens most closely." Her heart still stilled at those words. She understood them without needing to ask why. The wilderness was not exile, it was initiation. To live beneath heaven's promise was to walk between abundance and emptiness, always trusting that both belonged to the same design. That night, the camp settled under a canopy of stars. The desert wind moved softly through the tents, carrying the faint scent of myrrh and smoke. Rebekah lay awake, the stillness pressing gently against her chest. She thought of the path that had led her here, the well, the stranger, the choice, the long road through shifting sands, and now this sacred quiet. Was this what destiny felt like? Not thunder, not fire, but peace. In the distance, she could hear Isaac praying, his voice low and steady. The sound wrapped around her like a lullaby. Her eyes closed, and in her mind she saw a great tree, its roots buried deep in ancient soil, its branches reaching toward the stars. She felt herself become part of that tree, her life interwoven with something vast and timeless. Before sleep took her, she whispered a single line into the darkness. "May my heart never grow louder than the one who speaks in silence." Outside, the wilderness sighed, neither cruel nor kind, only eternal. It waited, as it always did, for faith to pass through it once more. The days began to slow, as if time itself moved to the rhythm of the wind. Rebekah learned the voice of the land, how it whispered in the evenings and sang in the heat of noon. She tended to the hearth, spoke gently with the women, and waited for Isaac's return from the fields. Yet beneath her calm, a quiet wonder lived. For though she now walked within the promise, her heart still listened for the one who had brought her here. In those early months, the wilderness became her teacher. She found beauty in the barren stretches, in the way the sand shimmered like liquid gold, in the way the stars returned each night with unwavering faithfulness. Sometimes, when the air grew cool, she walked to the edge of the camp and looked beyond the horizon. There, where the earth vanished into light, she imagined the unseen hand of God still shaping the road before her. Isaac watched her often, silently. He saw how she moved through the tents, never hurried, never idle. She carried peace in her steps, and the servants spoke of her kindness as though it were a fragrance that lingered long after she had passed. Reminded him of Sarah, his mother, the same quiet strength, the same trust that bends without breaking. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Isaac returned from his prayer in the fields. The sky blazed with copper and rose, and Rebekah stood at the doorway of their tent, her veil loose, her eyes reflecting the fire of dusk. He approached her, his expression softened by awe. "You look as though you've spoken with angels," he said. "Perhaps I have," she answered with a smile. "The desert has many voices. You only need to listen." He stepped closer. And what did it say? That love is not found in noise nor in haste. It is found in those who wait together beneath the same sky. Isaac's heart stirred, for though their union had been arranged by faith, affection had begun to bloom between them, slow, steady, sacred. He reached out, brushing the back of her hand with his fingers. "Then we will wait together," he said. The nights grew longer, filled with the sound of distant winds weaving through the dunes. Rebekah would sometimes wake to find Isaac watching the stars, his eyes tracing constellations with quiet devotion. He often spoke of his father's journey, how Abraham left everything for a promise that could not be seen. Rebekah listened, her heart swelling with the weight of their inheritance. "This land," Isaac would whisper, "was given to us by the voice of the unseen. Every hill is a word, every shadow a memory of that vow." "And now," Rebekah would answer, "it will remember us too." One night as she slept, she dreamed again, but not of wells or caravans. She dreamed of rivers flowing through dry land, of seeds breaking through stone, of a child's cry carried by the wind. When she woke, tears rested on her cheeks. She did not know what the dream meant, but she felt its truth, that the wilderness would one day bloom through her. When she told Isaac, he took her hand and said quietly, "Then God has spoken again, not through thunder, but through your rest." The days that followed were softer. The desert began to feel less like a boundary and more like a sanctuary, a place where heaven and earth could meet without witness. And though storms sometimes swept through the valley, tearing at the tents, Rebekah never feared. She knew now that peace was not the absence of wind, but the certainty of who held it. Each morning she rose before the sun, whispering her prayer to the dawn. "Let me walk gently, that the earth remembers my faith more than my footsteps." And the wilderness, faithful as ever, carried her words into eternity. Seasons passed, and Rebekah's life settled into rhythm, quiet days of tending, long evenings of prayer, soft laughter carried through the tents. Yet the wilderness, though peaceful, was never idle. It was a mirror, showing her not only beauty but waiting. The promise that had brought her here was not yet complete. The same silence that once felt sacred now began to feel heavy, as if heaven were holding its breath. Each night, Isaac and Rebekah knelt together beneath the stars, their prayers rising into the cool air. They asked for one thing, a child. A single spark of life through which the covenant would continue, the voice of the promise reborn in flesh. But months passed into years, and her womb remained still. At first, Rebekah met the silence with patience. She told herself that waiting was holy, that even the desert must rest before it blooms. But as the years deepened, a shadow began to grow within her. Not bitterness, but ache. The kind of ache that speaks in whispers when no one else can hear. One evening, as the sky faded into indigo, she walked beyond the edge of the camp, her veil drawn close around her. The horizon was empty, only sand, stone, and the quiet hum of eternity. She fell to her knees. "O Lord of my husband, God of Abraham," she whispered, her voice trembling with longing, "why do you hide the fruit of your promise from me? Have I not followed where you led? Have I not believed in the word that called me?" The desert did not answer. Only the wind stirred, brushing her hair across her face. But within that stillness she felt something, not a voice, not even a word, but presence. A warmth that spread through her chest, tender and infinite. It said without speaking, "I am not silent, I am preparing." Tears glimmered in her eyes. She bowed her head and stayed there until the stars returned, thousands upon thousands, each one burning with remembrance. When she returned to the tent, Isaac was waiting by the fire. He said nothing, only took her hand and held it to his heart. In that touch, she felt the same quiet trust that had guided Abraham to bind his son and Sarah to laugh at the impossible. "I prayed tonight," she whispered, "not for strength but for peace." Isaac smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the flame. "Then you have already been answered." Time continued, its silence no longer cruel. Rebekah learned to move within it like water, to find meaning not in what was withheld, but in what was growing unseen. The other women pitied her, but she carried herself with calm dignity, for she knew that waiting was never wasted in the hands of the divine. One twilight, while she rested beside the doorway, the scent of rain filled the air. It was rare in that land, soft, delicate rain that fell like silver threads across the dust. She stepped into it, lifting her face toward the heavens. The drops kissed her cheeks, her hands, her closed eyes, and deep within her, deeper than sorrow, deeper than longing, something stirred. A pulse, a promise awakening. She gasped softly, her hand upon her stomach, as a quiet warmth spread through her being. The rain fell harder, washing over the camp, soaking the parched earth. She knew then the desert was busy, ending to bloom. She fell to her knees, whispering through her tears, "You have remembered me." That night, as Isaac slept, Rebekah lay awake, her heart alive with awe, for in the silence of the wilderness life had begun to whisper, and heaven, faithful as always, smiled through the rain. The season turned gentle, the air grew softer, the earth greened in places where even hope had stopped looking. Rebekah moved through the camp differently now, her steps slower, her gaze deeper. Beneath her robe, the secret of life had begun to stir. Her hands often rested upon her belly as if cradling a prayer. When Isaac saw her walking in the morning light, a peace came over him that words could not hold. He had known faith his entire life, but now he saw it taking shape before him, not in altars or wells, but in the quiet strength of the woman he loved. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of his work, simply to watch her draw water or braid her hair or stand in silence as the wind moved around her. He saw in her something he had never seen before, the reflection of heaven's tenderness. In the evenings, when the shadows stretched long across the valley, he would sit beside her, his hand upon hers, and listen. "Tell me," he would whisper, "what does it feel like, the promise moving within you?" Rebekah would close her eyes and smile. "Like the earth when the rain returns," she said, "quiet at first, then alive with unseen roots." He would nod, his heart caught between wonder and humility, for he knew their story was not just their own, it was the continuation of a vow spoken long before their births, a thread woven through generations that began with Abraham and would one day stretch into eternity. But with the promise came mystery. The life within her did not move as she expected. At times she felt stillness so complete it frightened her, at others a turmoil that shook her from sleep. The movement was not one life, but two, as though a struggle had begun inside her before either child had seen the sun. The first time she felt them wrestle, she cried out. The women rushed to her tent, but she waved them away, clutching her stomach with trembling hands. "Something is happening," she whispered, "something I cannot see." That night when the camp slept, she went outside and knelt beneath the stars. "O Lord," she cried, "if this is your promise, why do I feel such struggle within me?" And the voice came not in thunder, but as it always had, in stillness. It spoke to her heart, not her ears. "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger." The words sank into her like water into dry earth. They brought both clarity and sorrow, peace and trembling. She did not yet understand, but she knew the story within her was larger than herself. Her womb had become the battlefield of destiny. When she told Isaac, his brow furrowed in thought, but he did not question her. He had learned that the voice of God often came through the quiet faith of those who listened, not those who spoke. Together they sat in silence, the fire between them burning low. Rebekah's gaze wandered to the stars, those same stars Abraham once counted, the same promise now forming beneath her heart. "If two nations are within me," she whispered, "then may both remember the mercy of their beginning." Isaac's hand tightened around hers. "And may the promise of peace outlive their war." The wind sighed through the tents, and the stars above shimmered like watchful eyes. Somewhere deep within her, the children stirred again, not in anger but in life. And though Rebekah could not yet see their faces, she felt it, the divine tension between them, the thread that would shape the history of generations. She was no longer merely a bride. She had become the living threshold of prophecy. The wilderness that once taught her waiting now prepared her for revelation. The months that followed moved like waves, some days calm and glowing, others fierce with pain. Rebekah learned to breathe with the rhythm of heaven's mystery. Her body became both sanctuary and storm. The two children within her pressed and wrestled, their unseen limbs shaping her nights with restless motion. But she did not despair. She remembered the words whispered into her spirit, "Two nations are in your womb." When she could not sleep, she would rest her hand upon her belly and hum softly, ancient melodies her mother once sang beside the well. Isaac would sit near her, silent as a prayer, his gaze tender and protective. He would sometimes whisper into the dark, "Peace, little ones. The world is not yet ready for your quarrel." Rebekah would smile faintly, though her eyes glistened. Perhaps the world never will be. She often found herself remembering her own journey, the day she left Nahor, the road through dust and fire, the first moment she saw Isaac walking in the field. Dusk. Back then, she had thought destiny was something that awaited her outside, beyond the horizon, beyond her reach. Now she knew the truth. Destiny had always lived within. The day came when the pain grew sharp, spreading through her like thunder. The women of the camp gathered, their hands steady, their voices firm. The air was thick with heat, the sky low and gold. Isaac waited outside the tent, his face turned upward, whispering the name of God with each breath. When the cries ceased, the sound that followed was not one but two. Twin wails split the silence, the first, raw and wild, the second, softer, slower, deliberate. The women smiled through tears. 2 sons, they said, 2 blessings. They placed the firstborn in her arms, a child covered in reddish hair, strong and fierce even in infancy. He shall be called Esau, Rebekah said, her voice weak but certain. Then they brought her the younger, pale and smooth, his small hand gripping his brother's heel. And this one, she whispered, shall be called Jacob. Isaac entered, his face alight with awe. He knelt beside her, his eyes moving from one child to the other. The promise is alive, he murmured. The covenant breathes again. Rebekah looked at the newborns, one sleeping, one restless, and felt both joy and unease. She saw in their faces the beginning of something greater than family. She remembered the divine words, "The elder shall serve the younger." It was not an easy prophecy to love. Yet she held them both, one against each arm, and prayed that whatever heaven had written would unfold with mercy. As night fell, the tent dimmed to an amber glow. Isaac sat close beside her, and together they watched the twins sleep. "They are different already," he said. Rebekah nodded. 2 hearts beating to 2 songs, and yet both made by the same breath. Her eyes lingered on Jacob, the smaller one, quiet yet unyielding. There was a stillness in him that reminded her of the well where her story began. He would grow into cunning, yes, but also into vision, one who wrestled not with flesh but with the unseen. Esau, strong and radiant, would love the hunt and the open field, but Jacob would love the mystery. And in that difference, history would find its turning. Outside, the stars burned brighter than they had in years, as though heaven itself was watching the 2 brothers who would shape nations. The promise had found its heirs, but the piece of the promise, that was yet to be born. Rebekah leaned back, exhaustion softening her edges. Isaac's hand found hers in the dark. "You have given life to the future," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "And the future is never gentle." Then, with the scent of the desert drifting through the tent and the soft breathing of her sons beside her, Rebekah closed her eyes, and the world for a moment was perfectly still. Years passed like gentle rivers carving through stone. The household of Isaac flourished beneath the vast Canaan skies, yet in its stillness, a quiet division began to grow, not born of cruelty but of destiny. The twins, now boys, carried the echo of their prophecy within their very bones. Esau grew into the likeness of the earth, strong, broad-shouldered, his skin tanned by the hunt and the sun. He loved the wild places, the mountains, the thrill of chasing life through the fields. His laughter was loud, his temper brief. He lived simply, without thought of the future, for his heart belonged to the present moment, to the pulse of blood, to the scent of freedom. Jacob, by contrast, was the stillness between breaths. His eyes were keen, quiet, always listening. He stayed among the tents, tending flocks, watching the patterns of clouds and people alike. Where Esau's hands found strength, Jacob's found understanding. He spoke little, but when he did, his words lingered like the afterglow of light. Rebekah watched them both with love that could not divide itself, yet her soul remembered the whisper from heaven, "The elder shall serve the younger." The truth of that word lived in her heart like a seed, buried deep, unseen yet alive. She often prayed that it would never sprout in pain, that the promise could unfold gently without fracture. But heaven, she knew, rarely chooses the easy path for sacred things. Isaac adored Esau. The boy's vigor, his laughter, his scent of open fields reminded him of his youth, of the strength he once carried up the mountain where obedience had been tested. "My son," he would often say, resting a hand upon Esau's shoulder, "the earth loves you." Rebekah, meanwhile, found her peace in Jacob's company. His silence mirrored her own. When she spoke of dreams, he listened. When she prayed, he watched with the same stillness his father once had. And sometimes, when she looked into his eyes, she felt the tremor of the divine promise, subtle, mysterious, unstoppable. One evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, the family gathered for the evening meal. Esau returned from the fields empty-handed, his face flushed with weariness. The smell of lentil stew drifted through the air Jacob's making. The aroma of earth and spice filled the tent, and Esau's hunger flared like fire. "Give me some of that red stew," he said, collapsing beside his brother. "I'm faint with hunger." Jacob looked at him quietly, the spoon pausing in his hand. The moment was brief, yet it felt eternal, a single breath suspended between choice and consequence. "Sell me your birthright," Jacob said softly. Esau laughed at first, dismissing the words, but the hunger in his body drowned the wisdom in his spirit. "I am dying of hunger. What good is a birthright to me now?" Jacob's eyes did not waver. "Swear to me." And Esau swore. With one word, one careless vow, he traded the unseen for the immediate. The stew was warm, comforting, and fatal in its simplicity. He ate, drank, and rose again, unaware that heaven had just shifted course through his appetite. From the doorway, Rebekah watched, her breath caught. She said nothing, but her heart ached, not with pride nor with fear, but with the weight of divine inevitability. She understood now that the prophecy was no longer distant. It was here, unfolding before her eyes. That night, when the camp fell asleep, she stepped outside, lifting her face toward the wind. The stars above shimmered, and she felt again the same sacred hush that had filled the desert years ago when she said, "I will go." Only now, the choice was no longer hers alone. The path she had walked in faith was being continued through her son, one who, like her, listened not to the noise of the world but to the whisper of destiny. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Your will, not mine." And far above, heaven answered with silence, the same silence that has always preceded revelation. There are silences in life that do not wound, they refine. The years that followed the birth of her sons were marked by such silence. The camp grew larger, the herds multiplied, the wells deepened, yet Rebekah felt a quiet distance forming between her and the heavens that had once spoken so clearly. Isaac prayed often, his words lifting like smoke through the dawn air. Rebekah prayed too, but her prayers were no longer for herself. They were for understanding, for peace in the midst of the unseen design now weaving itself through her household. For though her body had once carried the promise, her soul now carried its weight. Esau grew wild and golden, Jacob thoughtful and pale. The prophecy that God had spoken to her still trembled in her memory. The elder shall serve the younger. Yet each time she looked upon her sons, the meaning of those words changed shape like light seen through water. She watched Esau hunt, his laughter echoing through the fields, his strength like that of the land itself. Isaac's eyes glowed with pride when he saw him return, his arms full of game. "The Lord blesses the hands of my son," Isaac would say, his voice thick with affection. But Rebekah saw more than strength. She saw the fire that could consume, the impulse that could trade eternity for a moment's satisfaction, the same hunger that once sold a birthright for stew. And she trembled. Jacob remained near her, learning the ways of stillness. He carried questions like treasures, always hidden, never spent. When he spoke, it was to ask of heaven, of purpose, of patience, of dreams. Rebekah loved him not because he was quieter, but because he listened to the silence she had come to know so well. Yet as the seasons turned, the silence grew heavier. Isaac's sight began to fade, and with it his certainty. The covenant was nearing its next turning, and heaven, though unseen, began to stir the winds of destiny. One night, as the tent slept, Rebekah lay awake beneath the sound of shifting sand. Her heart beat slowly, but her mind wandered to the words she once heard in the wilderness, 2 nations, 2 people. She felt them again, those ancient words, not as prophecy but as choice. A choice that would soon ask everything of her. In the quiet she rose and stepped outside. The moon hung low, veiled in thin clouds. The desert stretched endless before her, familiar, eternal, listening. She whispered to an old friend, "You remember, don't you? The promise you gave me at the well, you have not forgotten it." A faint wind brushed her face, stirring her veil as if in answer. The same wind that once carried her from Nahar now circled her once more, soft but insistent, a reminder that destiny does not sleep. Rebekah closed her eyes. The years of waiting, the prayers unanswered, the silence, it all led to this coming moment. The time of decision was near again. Inside the tent, her sons slept, one dreaming of wild fields, the other of celestial ladders yet unseen. Between them lay a chasm that only her hands would bridge and break. But for now she stood in the doorway, her face turned toward the dark horizon. She felt the pull of fate the way a seed feels the pull of light, not as command, but as truth. And though her lips did not move, heaven heard her heart whisper the same words it had long ago at the well. "Let me be faithful, even when it costs me everything." The night wind carried her vow away toward a dawn that would soon change her house forever. Morning came softly, spilling gold across the hills. The camp stirred awake, goats bleating, servants murmuring, the faint clang of bronze vessels. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of daily life, Rebekah sensed a trembling. Heaven had begun to move again, quietly but surely, like a tide returning to shore after years of retreat. Isaac's eyesight was failing. His world had dimmed to shadow and scent, but his faith remained. One afternoon, Rebekah entered his tent and saw him seated near the lamp, his hands resting upon his knees, his lips moving in silent prayer. The flame flickered against the folds of his robe, painting him in the same warmth she remembered from the day they first met. "Are you praying for rain?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. Isaac smiled faintly. "For discernment. The days grow short and my strength with them. It is time to bless my son." Her breath caught not from surprise but from recognition. The moment she had long awaited had come. Heaven's promise, buried deep in her memory, rose like a spark in her chest. The elder shall serve the younger, but Isaac's next words pierced her stillness. "Bring me Esau," he said. "My soul loves the smell of his garments, the taste of his game. I will bless him before I die." Rebekah bowed her head, her heart pounding like distant thunder. In that instant, the silence of her years shattered. All her prayers, all her patience, converged into this choice, one that would require not faith alone, but courage sharpened by love. When she left the tent, the sunlight felt different, harsher. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. She found Jacob near the herds, tending to the young lambs, his hands gentle, his eyes thoughtful. "My son," she said, her voice steady though her spirit trembled, "I heard your father speak to Esau. He will bless him before he dies. But listen, what I am about to say is not mine alone. It was spoken before you were born." Jacob straightened, uncertainty clouding his brow. "Mother, what do you mean?" She met his gaze. "You must go to Esau's place." His breath caught. "Deceive my father, he will know. Esau's skin is rough, mine is smooth. If he touches me," her eyes softened, yet burned with conviction. "Then let the curse fall on me, my son. Do as I say and bring me 2 young goats from the flock. I will prepare them as your father loves." Jacob hesitated. He saw in her face not cunning but prophecy, the echo of something older than either of them. Slowly he nodded. Together they worked in silence, their movements guided by purpose rather than deceit. Rebekah's hands were steady as she prepared the meal, her heart breaking and believing all at once. When the food was ready, she took the skins of the goats and placed them upon Jacob's hands and neck. Then she draped Esau's best robe across his shoulders, the smell of the field still clinging to it. "Go," she whispered, her fingers lingering upon his arm. "Let him feel your hands, hear your voice, and bless you. It is not trickery, Jacob, it is fulfillment." Jacob looked into her eyes, and for a moment he saw not his mother, but the woman who once said, "I will go," and never turned back. "May the Lord be with you," she said softly, "as he was with me." He left, and the tent fell silent again. Rebekah remained kneeling by the hearth, her fingers pressed together, her lips moving without sound. The same silence that once carried her prayers now held her trembling heart. She did not ask for mercy, she asked for understanding. Outside, a single breeze moved through the camp, the faint sigh of destiny shifting once more. And when Jacob returned, carrying the blessing his father had spoken, Rebekah saw in his eyes both awe and sorrow. The covenant had passed through her hands again, and with it, the cost of heaven's will. The moment Jacob left his father's tent, the air itself seemed to tremble. The blessing had been spoken, words that could not be unspoken, threads that could not be untied. Isaac's voice had carried the weight of heaven, unaware that it had fallen upon the younger son. And now, the prophecy whispered to Rebekah long ago has found its echo in the world of men. Jacob stood before her, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling beneath the borrowed fur. The scent of Esau's garments clung to him, the smell of the open fields, of earth and wildness. Rebekah saw him and knew that destiny had passed through her once more, as it had at the well, as it had on the road, as it always would. "Mother," Jacob whispered, "he blessed me." His voice was a mixture of wonder and fear. "But what have we done?" Rebekah placed her hands upon his cheeks, her eyes deep with sorrow and grace. "We have not stolen," she said softly. "We have remembered. The Lord does not forget his word." But even as she spoke, a cry rose from outside, the cry of Esau, fierce and wounded, a sound that tore through the camp like the breaking of the sky. "Father," he roared, "bless me, even me also." Rebekah closed her eyes. She did not weep. Her tears had already been spent in years of silence. This was the price of revelation. When heaven speaks, the earth divides. From within the tent came Isaac's trembling voice, full of sorrow and awe. "Your brother came with subtlety and has taken away your blessing." Esau's fury filled the camp. He tore his garments, his cry echoing into the wilderness. "He has supplanted me these 2 times. Is there not a blessing left for me?" But Isaac, weary and old, could only tremble. He knew then what Rebekah had known all along, that the promise had chosen its vessel, and no hand of man could undo it. That night the camp was heavy with silence. Jacob stayed near his mother, his face pale, his heart breaking beneath the weight of what had been gained. Rebekah held him close, though her own soul trembled. She knew what would come next. "Esau plans to kill you," she whispered, her voice low but certain. "He will not rest until his grief finds blood. You must flee to my brother Laban in Harran. There, wait until his anger cools." Jacob's eyes widened. "And you? Will I see you again?" Rebekah's voice faltered for the first time. "The paths we walk for heaven are often lonely, my son. But wherever you go, remember the God who called me will guide you too." The dawn found her awake, standing at the edge of the camp. She watched as Jacob departed, his figure small against the endless horizon. The desert wind stirred her veil, carrying whispers of farewells unspoken. She did not call out. She had no words left that could hold him. In her heart, 2 sorrows wrestled, the ache of a mother who sends her son into exile, and the quiet triumph of a prophetess who has seen the word of God fulfilled. As the dust of his departure faded into light, she turned back toward the tents. Isaac sat alone, silent, his sight dimmed but his spirit clear. When she entered, he did not look at her, yet he knew. "Did you know?" he asked simply. Rebekah stood still. The air between them felt ancient. "I did," she answered, "and I feared the silence more than the truth." Isaac nodded slowly, his face lined with grief and understanding. "Then may the Lord deal kindly with you as he has with me. For even our deceptions, when born of faith, may serve his design." She knelt beside him, taking his hand, the weight of years pressing softly between them. Outside, the wind carried Jacob's name across the sands. Rebekah closed her eyes, hearing again the echo of the prophecy that had shaped her life. "2 nations are in your womb. Now one has fled, one remained." And the silence of heaven, once her comfort, had returned once more, not as absence but as completion. The wind over Canaan changed after Jacob's departure. It no longer carried the scent of peace but of distance. A silence stretched thin between tents and memory. Rebekah felt it each morning as she rose to prepare the bread, as she poured water into the basin, as she stood by the doorway where her son once prayed. The air itself seemed to remember him. Esau's shadow grew heavier across the camp. His hands, once quick to laughter, were now quick to wrath. The hurt in his heart burned brighter than any fire she had known. Yet when she looked upon him, Rebekah did not see only anger. She saw sorrow wearing the face of pride. Same sorrow that haunted her own reflection at night. Isaac spoke little now. His voice had grown faint, his eyes clouded beyond sight. Yet the lines of his face spoke the truth that both he and Rebekah carried in silence, that what had been done was not theft but prophecy fulfilled. Still, prophecy never moves without pain. Sometimes Rebekah would walk to the edge of the valley and gaze toward the north, where Jacob's trail vanished into the wilderness. She would whisper his name into the wind, though no echo returned. She wondered if he had reached Harran safely, if the Lord who once guided her footsteps now guarded him. She wondered if he remembered her words, "The God who called me will guide you too." One night she dreamed of him. She saw Jacob sleeping beneath the stars, his head upon a stone. From the earth rose a ladder of light, stretching into the sky, and angels moved upon it like flames ascending and descending. Above them, a voice vast, gentle, infinite spoke over him. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring." When she woke, tears streamed down her face. The same peace that had found her at the well now found her again. Heaven had not abandoned the soul. And she sent away. It was writing him into the promise. She rose and stepped outside, the moonlight washing her face in silver. Isaac stirred inside, his frail body shifting upon the bed. "You dreamed again," he murmured. "I could hear your heart." "Yes," she whispered. "He is safe. The Lord has spoken to him." Isaac smiled faintly. "Then the promise walks forward, though our feet no longer can." Rebekah knelt beside him, resting her head against his hand. The years had carved him thin, yet his spirit remained strong like an old tree whose roots still drink from deep waters. "You did what you believed was right," he said softly, "and I see now heaven chose through you." Her breath trembled, "and yet the price is loneliness." Isaac's eyes turned toward the tent's open flap where the desert stretched in silence. "Every covenant has its wilderness, Rebekah. Abraham's was the mountain. Ours is the space between suns." Outside, the wind moaned low across the sand, carrying with it the scent of tamarisk and myrrh. Rebekah closed her eyes and felt the truth of his words settle over her like dust, quiet, inevitable, divine. Days turned into moons, moons into years. She grew older, her hair touched with the silver of remembrance. The tents changed. Servants came and went, but her thoughts remained anchored to two names: Jacob, the chosen, walking the road of destiny, and Esau, the forsaken, bound to the ache of his own pride. Yet even for Esau she prayed. Each night before sleep she whispered, "Do not let bitterness claim him, O Lord. Let him find peace even beyond the promise." For she knew, though heaven had chosen the younger, grace was never withheld from the elder. In God's design, even rejection is not without redemption. And so Rebekah, once the woman who said, "I will go," now waited once more, not for a husband, not for a sign, but for the return of the son who carried the covenant in his steps and the voice of heaven in his dreams. Rebekah's hair had grown pale as the moonlight now. Each morning, she felt time move differently, slower, softer, more sacred. She walked among the tents like a memory that refused to fade, and though her voice was gentle, her presence carried the authority of one who had once been chosen to hear heaven's whisper directly. Isaac spent most days in silence. His eyes no longer saw the earth, but his heart, still tethered to the unseen, seemed to look beyond it. When Rebekah entered his tent, he would turn toward her as if the sound of her footsteps alone could draw light into his blindness. They no longer spoke much of Jacob or Esau, for both names carried too much ache, too much holiness. Yet in their silence they prayed. At dusk, when the shadows lengthened and the herds returned, Rebekah would sit outside, watching the color drain slowly from the sky. The air would hum with insects, the soft rhythm of evening. Sometimes when the wind blew north, she would imagine it carrying her thoughts to Harran, to Jacob. She pictured him older now, his hands calloused by labor, his eyes sharper with wisdom. She imagined him remembering her not as the mother who deceived, but as the mother who believed. One night while she watched the stars rise, Isaac's frail voice came from within the tent. "Rebekah," he called, "come near." She entered and knelt beside him, taking his thin hand in hers. His skin felt cool, his pulse faint but steady. "I have been remembering," he said, his voice low and measured. "The day we met, the well, the servant, the prayer. Do you know why I loved you at first sight?" She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Because the Lord wrote it so." He shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him. "Because you carried light, not the light of beauty but of calling. I felt it when I saw you, that heaven had chosen you to continue what began with my father. And though your choices have brought sorrow, they have also brought fulfillment. The covenant is alive because you listened when I could not hear." Rebekah bowed her head, tears falling silently. "I only followed what was spoken to me, Isaac. I feared the silence more than I feared being misunderstood." Isaac reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. "Then blessed be the woman who heard God in the quiet." They sat that way for a long while, husband and wife, prophet and listener, the living and the fading. The oil lamp beside them flickered, casting their shadows together upon the tent wall, one shape dissolving gently into the other. Later that night, when Rebekah stepped outside, the wind had changed again. It came from the east, the direction of Jacob's journey. She closed her eyes and felt it brush against her face like a familiar hand. For the first time in many years, peace filled her heart. She did not need a word or letter to know. Jacob was alive and heaven was still with him. The following day, Esau returned from a hunt. He stood at the edge of the camp, watching his mother from afar. His hair was streaked with gray now, his eyes carrying both fire and weariness. Rebekah saw him and smiled, though sorrow lived behind the curve of her lips. He did not come close, but he did not turn away either. That night she prayed for him again, longer than usual, softer than ever. "Lord," she whispered, "I know your promise lies with Jacob, but let your mercy lie with Esau, for both are mine and both are yours." In that prayer, something in her finally settled. The ache that had once driven her life became still. The prophecy that had once divided her family now rested upon her lips like a gentle psalm. Rebekah looked toward the dark horizon and smiled through tears. "You have chosen, my Lord," she murmured, "and I have obeyed. That is enough." The stars above flickered brighter, as though the heavens themselves bowed to honor her faith, the faith of a woman who once drew water for a stranger and ended up watering the roots of nations. The nights grew cooler, the stars sharper, as if the heavens themselves drew nearer to listen. Rebekah had grown old, but her spirit remained luminous, a vessel of quiet fire. Her hands, once strong enough to draw water from the well and hold the weight of prophecy, now trembled when she prayed. Yet every tremor was holy, a rhythm of faith that would not fade. Isaac slept more often now, drifting between the world of the living and the whisper of eternity. Sometimes, as Rebekah watched him rest, she saw in his face the boy who once carried wood up the mountain, trusting his father completely. His faith had never left him. It had simply deepened, turning into the peace of surrender. And Rebekah, the woman who once said, "I will go," now found herself standing at the threshold again. Only this time she was not leaving home. She was preparing to leave the world itself. Each morning, she rose slowly and walked outside to greet the dawn. The desert stretched before her, endless and golden as it always had. But where others saw emptiness, she saw the footprints of angels, faint, invisible trails of the same messengers who once walked the ladder in her dream of Jacob. She smiled faintly, for she knew now that heaven had never been far. It had always dwelled just beyond the veil of sight. Esau visited her more often in those days. His anger had dimmed with the years, replaced by a weary tenderness. He never spoke of Jacob, and she did not force his tongue to remember. They spoke instead of the herd of the harvest of the shape of clouds. Yet beneath the smallness of their words flowed forgiveness, wordless but true. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Esau lingered beside her tent. The air smelled of dust and honey. "Mother," he said quietly, "do you still pray for me?" Rebekah looked up at him, her eyes pale and kind. "Every night. Even after what I said, what I swore." "Especially after," she whispered. "The ones who stray furthest need the most light to find their way home." Esau bowed his head, unable to speak. When he finally left, she watched him go, her heart both aching and at peace. She knew then that though heaven had chosen Jacob for the covenant, Esau had been chosen for grace, and in the end both were blessed. That night she dreamed again. The same ladder of light rose from the earth, but this time she was at its base, not Jacob. The rungs shimmered like fire, reaching beyond the stars. A voice spoke from above, the same voice that once called her to leave Nahor, the same that whispered destiny into her womb. "Rebekah," it said, calm as eternity, "you have done what was asked. Through your courage, nations were born. Through your faith, the promise endured. Through your love, heaven remembered mercy." She felt herself weeping, not from sorrow, but from release. "Was I worthy?" she whispered. The voice replied, "You were willing." And that is what I have always called worthy. When she awoke, dawn had come. The camp was still. Isaac lay asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even. She rose one last time, stepped outside, and faced the rising sun. The light spilled across her face, warm and golden. She felt the wind, soft, endless, brush her veil aside as if welcoming her home. Rebekah closed her eyes and whispered a final prayer, her lips forming the words like a sigh. "Let the promise live on in their hands. Let the voice that chose me speak again through them." And as the first light of morning touched the tents of Abraham's line, the desert seemed to bow in silence. The woman who once drew water for a stranger had poured her entire life into heaven's design. She had chosen her destiny, and through her, destiny had chosen the world. There is a quiet that follows every storm, a silence not of peace, but of reckoning. In the years after Jacob's departure, that silence fell heavy over Rebekah's household. It was the kind of stillness that listens to footsteps long faded, the kind that remembers voices even after they've turned to wind. Isaac, though aged and weary, continued to rise each morning and pray. His blindness had become complete, yet he saw more than he ever had before. "I know now," he once murmured to Rebekah, "that what heaven chooses no man can unchoose." His tone carried both awe and regret. For though his heart still favored Esau, his spirit had come to rest in the will of God. Rebekah spoke little in those days. She moved like a shadow through the tents, her silvered hair wrapped in linen, her eyes far beyond the horizon. Sometimes she would pause while grinding grain or drawing water, and the servants would find her whispering under her breath, not in sorrow but remembrance. "He is safe," she would murmur. "The Lord walks with him still." But though Jacob was far away, his absence filled the camp more than his presence ever had. Esau still burned with hurt, though the fire within him had cooled into embers. He worked the fields with strength that bordered on fury, returning home at dusk with hands stained in earth and heart heavy with unsaid words. When Rebekah looked at him, she saw not anger but a wound that time refused to close. One evening she stood by the well, the same kind of well where her story once began. The sun hung low, turning the water's surface to gold. She leaned over and saw her reflection tremble in the ripples. Beneath her face, she imagined she saw another, younger, radiant, holding a jar and smiling at a stranger who asked for water. For a moment the two reflections merged, and she felt the span of her entire life close in upon itself. The promise had moved through her, yes, but promises are never light. They are carried like flame, beautiful, necessary, and burning. She thought of the day she sent Jacob away, the way the dawn swallowed his figure as he vanished into the wilderness. She had never wept then. But now, years later, standing at the well, the tears finally came. They slid down her face in silence, falling into the same kind of water where her faith once began. "O Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I did what you asked. I trusted the word you gave me, though it broke the peace of my house. But tell me, was I right to choose what you had already chosen?" The wind stirred, soft and slow, bending the reeds around her. For a moment she thought she heard a voice within it, not loud, not distant, but tender, as if the breath of heaven itself leaned close. "You did not choose alone." Rebekah closed her eyes, the words resting against her like warmth after rain. That night, as the stars climbed above the camp, she sat beside Isaac. His hand, thin and trembling, sought hers. "Do you still see him?" he asked quietly. "In my dreams," she answered. "Always walking, always becoming." Isaac smiled faintly. "Then the blessing is working." Rebekah turned to him, studying his face, lined, worn, but peaceful. "It cost us much," she whispered. Isaac nodded. "All blessings do. The greater the promise, the deeper the ache." They sat in silence for a long while, two old souls resting upon the memory of a covenant larger than their years. Outside, the night wind passed through the tamarisk trees, carrying the faint sound of distant thunder. It was as if heaven itself was reminding them, the story is not finished. The blessing still moves. And in the quiet of that knowing, Rebekah felt her heart lift, not in joy, but in acceptance. The weight she carried was not hers to regret. It was hers to bear until faith could pass it forward. The next morning rose pale and calm, a soft light spreading over the tents like a whispered prayer. Rebekah stood outside before the camp, fully woke, her veil lifted by the breeze. She felt the faint chill of dawn on her skin, and for a fleeting moment she could almost smell the fragrance of the well in Nahar, that first scent of calling, the breath of beginnings. But now her life had become the slow ebb of endings, the gentle surrender of one who has seen the circle close. Inside the tent, Isaac stirred in his sleep. His breath was shallow, his form fragile beneath his robes. Rebekah watched him, remembering the man she met by the fields, tall, radiant, eyes clear as morning. That man had faded with the years, yet something in his spirit remained untouched. The flame of faith, though dim in body, still burned bright in the heart. As she sat beside him, Isaac whispered, "Rebekah, the voice that spoke to me in the field, it speaks again." Her hand tightened around him. "What does it say?" He smiled faintly, eyes closed, his voice thin as the wind. "That promise continues, that our waiting has not been in vain." Tears warmed her cheeks. It had been so long since she had heard heaven speak through anyone but herself, and yet here it was again, not thunder, not fire, but peace. She leaned closer. "Then the Lord has remembered us." Isaac nodded, his lips trembling. He never forgot. Outside, the servants began to move, their voice low, their footsteps careful. Esau was already gone to the fields. His absence was his offering. Rebekah knew he avoided these moments, perhaps afraid of the frailty of his father, or perhaps of the echoes of a blessing that no longer belonged to him. But she prayed for him all the same, that grace would find him, even in his distance. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the faint light grew stronger. Somewhere beyond that light, Jacob walked the same land of promise in another place, his hands learning patience, his heart being shaped by the same God who once shaped hers. She could not see him, but she felt him, a thread of spirit connecting mother to son, unseen but unbroken. "Isaac," she whispered, "do you think he dreams of home?" He smiled, though his eyes stayed closed. "He dreams of what you taught him, to listen, to wait, to trust the silence." Her heart trembled. "I fear he carries too much of me." Isaac's hand moved slightly, finding hers again. "He carries what heaven gave. What you gave was only the courage to hear." The wind shifted through the tent, stirring the oil lamp beside them. Its flame bent low, then straightened again. Rebekah watched it and thought of all the times that light had burned beside her, when she first entered the tent as a young bride, when she knelt to pray for children, when she wept after Jacob's flight. Always the same flame, always the same promise, flickering and faithful. As Isaac drifted back into sleep, Rebekah sat still, her fingers brushing the folds of his robe. The years had taught her that every gift of God bore a weight. To be chosen was never to be spared. It was to be trusted with pain that others could not carry. She understood now what the angel had meant at the well all those years ago, that her gentleness had been her strength, her waiting for her offering, her obedience to her crown. When the sun rose higher, she stepped outside once more. The desert stretched before her, wide and glimmering. She thought of all who had walked it before her, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and all who would come after, Jacob, his sons, and the nations that would be born through him. She lifted her face toward heaven, the warmth touching her skin like a blessing renewed. "Lord," she whispered, "you have asked much, and I have given much. But let your promise rest easy now, not as a burden, but as light." A bird passed overhead, silent against the morning sky. And in that stillness, Rebekah felt it, the faint release of heaven's hand. The weight she had carried so long no longer pressed against her chest. It hovered around her instead, like air, like peace. That evening, as the sky darkened to bronze and violet, Rebekah lit the lamp beside Isaac's bed. Its small flame filled the tent with trembling warmth. The night wind whispered outside, carrying with it the soft rustle of palm leaves and the murmured prayers of servants settling into rest. But inside their tent, time felt suspended, as if all of creation held its breath, waiting for what would follow. Isaac's breathing had become shallow. Rebekah sat close, one hand upon his shoulder, the other upon her heart. She could feel the space between his breath stretching wider, like the pause between one age and the next. Yet there was no fear in her. She had lived long enough with heaven's mysteries to know that every silence is only the threshold of another voice. Isaac stirred and whispered her name. "I am here," she said softly. He turned his face toward her, the faintest smile upon his lips. "You remember the field?" Her eyes glistened. "How could I forget? You were praying when I saw you, and I knew I had been walking toward that moment all my life." Isaac's smile deepened, though faint. "When I lifted my eyes and saw you, I thought the promise had taken form. I did not know then that God had sent me not comfort, but a partner in faith." Rebekah pressed his hand gently. "We have walked long roads together, deserts and blessings alike, and you carried both with grace," he whispered. "You were the voice that kept the covenant alive when mine faltered. I thought I was blessing our sons, but it was you heaven had already blessed." Tears blurred her sight. "You always speak as though I were stronger than I am." Isaac's eyes, dim as they were, seemed to see her clearly. "You listened when I hesitated. You moved when I stood still. You bore the weight of what heaven required, not because you desired it, but because you believed." Outside, thunder murmured faintly beyond the hills, soft, distant, like the heartbeat of the sky. Rebekah leaned close, her forehead against his. "Rest now," she whispered. "Your journey is nearly done. I will carry what remains." Isaac's lips moved once more. "Then let the blessing rest upon you, Rebekah, for through your obedience the promise will outlive even time." His hand fell still. The flame in the lamp flickered, stretched thin, then steadied, as thou. Heaven itself refused to let the light die. Rebekah sat motionless, her tears falling silently. She did not weep from grief, but from gratitude, for she had witnessed a life that began with sacrifice and ended with peace. Outside, Esau returned late from the fields. The moon had risen, pale and solemn. He entered the tent quietly and saw his mother sitting beside Isaac, her posture calm, her eyes shining like the stars above. He knelt beside her without a word. She reached out and touched his face, brushing a strand of hair from his brow. "He has gone to rest," she said softly. Esau bowed his head. "He was a good man." Rebekah nodded. "He was a faithful one." They sat together in silence. The air was thick with memory, not of conflict, but of love that had endured through division. After a long while, Rebekah spoke again, her voice faint but steady. "Promise me, my son, when the years have passed, and when Jacob returns, you will not let anger remain between you. The promise cannot flourish in bitterness." Esau looked at her, his eyes filled with the weight of years. "If he returns," he said quietly, "I will forgive him." Rebekah smiled. "Then the promise will live on." That night, long after Esau had gone, Rebekah remained awake beside the lamp. The wind had gentled, and the stars above gleamed brighter than ever before. She felt no loneliness, only stillness, deep and kind. For the first time since the well of Nahor, the voice of heaven returned, not in command but in comfort. "Well done, daughter of faith. The blessing was heavy, but you carried it well." She closed her eyes and whispered into the silence, "It was never mine to carry alone." The lamp's flame bowed once, as if in reverence, and then rose again, unwavering. After Isaac's passing, the camp of Canaan fell into a quiet that seemed older than time. The servants moved with reverence. Even the wind passed softly through the tamarisk trees, as though mourning required gentleness. Rebekah sat in the doorway of her tent, wrapped in linen white as morning ash, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her body had grown frail, but her presence still commanded the air around her, calm, enduring, luminous. Esau came often in those days, not with anger as before, but with a silence that spoke of healing. His grief had softened him. He no longer burned with the fury of the sun passed over, for the years had taught him what youth could not, that heaven's choosing does not mean heaven's neglect. Rebekah saw it in his face. The boy of impulse had become a man of compassion. He would bring her the meat he hunted, seasoned just as Isaac had liked it, and sit beside her without words. Some evenings he would speak of the fields, the flocks, the weather. But sometimes, when the dusk grew deep and the lamps flickered low, he would say, "Mother, do you ever think of him?" She always answers, every day. Her voice carried no sorrow, only faith. The years had not erased Jacob's name from her heart, they had carved it deeper. Each sunrise reminded her of the boy who once dreamed beneath the stars, who wrestled with angels in visions, who walked toward a promise too vast to understand. She could not see him, but she felt him, a thread of spirit stretched thin between mother and son, shimmering through distance and time. When she prayed now, her words were no longer pleas, but blessings sent into the wind. "Wherever he wanders, Lord, make the ground beneath him kind. When he sleeps, let the stars remind him that I remember." Sometimes she would wake in the night, certain she had heard his voice faint, like an echo through water. Once she dreamed of a ladder again, but this time it reached both ways, from heaven to earth, and earth to heaven, and upon it climbed not angels but sons. She saw Jacob ascending one side and Esau upon the other, each step closing the space between them. When they met in the middle, she awoke with tears upon her face. One evening Esau found her watching the sunset. The sky was fire and gold, the horizon breathing with light. "He will come home someday," he said quietly. Rebekah smiled. "Yes," she answered, "when his heart is finished with the wilderness." Her words lingered in the air like prophecies. In those days, Rebekah no longer moved with the urgency of the living, but with the grace of one preparing to leave. She spoke often of the past, not with regret, but with gratitude. She told Esau the stories of Abraham, of the promise spoken under the stars, of the angel who stilled his father's hand. She told him that faith was not about knowing the path, but walking it even when all light had faded. And Esau listened. He had once thought his mother's silence was distant, but now he understood it was reverence. She did not speak of heaven often because she had lived too near its edge. When night fell, Rebekah would rest her head upon her hand and look upward. The stars of Canaan had become her scripture. She traced them as others trace letters upon a page, reading in their fire the stories she had helped to write: Abraham's covenant, Isaac's trust, Jacob's journey, Esau's forgiveness, all of them written in light. One night, as the camp slept, Rebekah whispered to the wind, "Tell him, wherever he is, that his mother waits still." The wind carried her words northward, over hills, over deserts, over the same sands that once bore her feet to destiny. And somewhere far away, under another sky, a man named Jacob stirred in his sleep, his heart quickening for reasons he could not name. For even across distance, love remembers its direction. Days became seasons, and seasons became years. The tents of Isaac still stood, but their laughter had long since faded into memory. The air of Canaan moved slower now, as if even the wind had grown old with her. Rebekah's hands were no longer steady, but her faith was. Every breath she drew was a prayer not for herself, but for the sons she had sent into the world like seeds into the soil of destiny. At night, she dreamed often of Jacob. In her dreams, he was walking, always walking, through lands she had never seen, carrying a staff worn smooth by years and a heart weighed by purpose. He did not look back, yet she felt that he remembered. He moved as one who had wrestled with both man and angel, marked by struggle but crowned by peace. Sometimes in those dreams she saw his children, 12 stars circling him, each with a light of its own, and she would wake with tears on her face, whispering, "So the promise continues." By day, Esau remained near. The anger that once defined him had melted away into quiet strength. He came to her tent not as the wild son of her youth, but as a man who had finally found rest. They would sit together at twilight, mother and son, two souls once divided now joined in a softer love. "Do you think he remembers me?" Esau asked one evening, his voice roughened by time. Rebekah smiled. "A son does not forget the mother who prayed him into the world." He nodded slowly, his gaze turned toward the fading horizon. "Then may God forgive the years between us." Her eyes softened. "He already has, my son. He forgave before you asked." Sometimes the servants would find her staring northward, her lips moving in silence. They thought her mind wandered, but it did not. She was listening. Listening for the echoes of the covenant, for the faint, sacred pulse that still bound her to Jacob and to the God who had written their story across generations. Her hair, once dark as the wells of Nahar, was now silver-white, shimmering in the lamplight like the threads of a veil between worlds. She moved less each day, yet her spirit seemed to stretch further than her body could follow. One night the air grew strange, heavy, fragrant, luminous. The stars seemed nearer than usual, their light like soft eyes watching her. Rebekah sat up in her bed, her heart steady, her breath calm. She felt a presence enter the tent, not the rustle of a servant or the weight of Esau's steps, but something gentler, ageless. It was the same stillness that had met her at the well so many years ago, the same voice that had whispered, "Will you go?" Now it spoke again, not from the sky but from within. "You have gone far enough, beloved. It is time to rest." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Then let me see them once more," she whispered. And she did. In the space between waking and eternity, she saw them both, Esau and Jacob, standing together beneath a great tree that shone with living light. No anger, no distance, only peace. The sons she bore in pain now stood side by side, reconciled by time and grace. When dawn came, the servants entered her tent and found her as though she had fallen asleep mid-prayer, her hands folded over her chest, her face serene. The lamp beside her still burned. Esau buried her near the cave of Machpelah beside Isaac, the man who had loved her and through her learned to trust heaven's design. The mourners said little, for her life was a sermon already spoken. And as they covered her grave with stones, the wind rose from the north, soft, fragrant, eternal, carrying her final blessing across the sands. The promise lives. The sons are one. The God who called me calls them still. That wind would travel far, over hills, through wilderness, across generations, until it found Jacob again in a distant land, whispering to his heart the same words his mother once lived by. "Go where heaven leads and remember who prayed you there." The earth was quiet again. The dust of morning had settled, and the sky above Canaan stretched wide and endless, carrying the faint scent of rain. Time, that gentle thief, moved on, and yet, in the hearts of those who had known her, Rebekah remained like a lamp that refused to go out. They said her tent still smelled of myrrh and wild grain, of the life she had lived between faith and fire. The servants spoke of her as one who Elked between worlds, her hands tending to the needs of men, her spirit always listening for the whisper of heaven. The place where she once prayed now drew the morning light differently, as if even the sun remembered her voice. In Harran, far away, Jacob often felt that memory stir within him. On quiet nights when the stars rose in silence and the flocks lay sleeping, He would feel a wind brush against his face, soft, maternal, familiar. And in that moment, though distance lay between them, he knew she was near. He would close his eyes and whisper, "Mother, I remember." For even in death, Rebekah's presence lingered where her prayers had been spoken. Her faith had become a living river flowing through generations, its current unseen but unending. Esau, too, carried her in his silence. When he looked upon the fields, he saw not just soil, but the patience she taught him. That strength without peace is only noise. Sometimes he would pause while skinning the day's hunt and look toward the horizon. The anger that once consumed him had long cooled into remembrance. He would speak her name under his breath, not in longing but in gratitude. "You waited for us," he would say, "and we have found our way." In the years that followed, the sons of Isaac grew into the fathers of nations, and still the promise moved like breath, like light, unseen yet everywhere. Rebekah's hands, though dust now, had set into motion the river that would one day carry prophets, kings, and the line of mercy itself. The elders told her story beside campfires, their voices slow and reverent. They spoke not of her deception, but of her devotion, of the woman who dared to believe that heaven's choice could pass through the quiet faith of a mother. They said she was the first to understand that destiny is not always spoken in thunder, but sometimes in a single whispered word: "Go." And somewhere beyond the horizon of mortal years, Rebekah walked again, not upon sand, but upon light. The desert that once tested her now bloomed beneath her steps. The well of Nahor shone like crystal in her memory, its waters clear, endless, and alive. She saw her reflection there, no longer worn by time but radiant with peace. Behind her came the sound of laughter, Isaac's, whole and young once more. He reached for her hand, and when their fingers met, the heavens brightened. The years fell away, and eternity opened like dawn. They stood together beneath a tree that shimmered with gold, the same vision she had seen in her final dream. Beneath its branches were her sons, reconciled and radiant, and around them gathered countless faces yet unborn, tribes and kings, shepherds and poets, all carrying the breath of her faith within them. Rebekah's eyes lifted toward the horizon of eternity, where light and time met as one. The voice that had once called her from the well now spoke again, tender as memory, vast as creation. "You have remembered well, beloved. Through your waiting I remembered my people." And the wind of heaven passed over her once more, the same wind that long ago stirred the waters of destiny, the same that carried her name through the wilderness and beyond. In that wind her story found its rest, not in sorrow, not in triumph, but in fulfillment. For she was never merely a wife, nor a mother, nor a name in a lineage. She was the silence through which the promise spoke, the heart that listened when heaven whispered, the woman who remembered and was remembered forever. And now, beloved listener, let the story rest within you. Let the fire of the past fade to embers soft and slow. The desert grows still again, the same desert that once carried her footsteps, the same silence that once answered her prayers. Breathe. You have walked with her through the wells and the wilderness, through faith and fear, through the soft ache of obedience. You have heard the voice that called Rebekah from her homeland, the whisper that shaped her destiny. Now that same voice calls gently to you, not from the heavens, but from within. It says, remember. Remember that waiting is not absence, it is preparation. Remember that silence is not abandonment, it is the sound of something sacred unfolding. And remember that every prayer, even the smallest one, echoes through eternity until it finds its home. The promise still lives in you, in the world, in the quiet breath between heartbeats. You are not forgotten. You are written into the same light that once guided her. So close your eyes now. Let the dust settle. Let the stars take their watch. The God who called her still moves in the wind that brushes your face, still whispers in the stillness after your sigh. You need not search for him, only listen. For when you listen, you will hear the same truth Rebekah knew. That destiny is not a thunderclap, but a whisper. That faith is not loud, but steady. And that love, divine love, never departs, it only deepens. Sleep, child of promise. sleep and remember. The voice, for in this stillness heaven remembers you too.